we do offer classes that go into more depth about the actual brewing process. So if you are looking for a hands-on tutorial on how to brew coffee at home, we do that as well. And we also offer regular tastings. It's sort of like a wine tasting, but for coffee. It's called a coffee cupping. And we do those weekly at our shop as well on Sundays. And I will be passing out some coffee, trying not to be too disruptive to Kyle's presentation, but I'll be passing out some coffee during the talk, so feel free to enjoy that. So I'll let Kyle start.
Hi, as Rachel said, my name is Kyle. Worked in coffee for about 7 years, mostly as a barista. And in January, I got to take my first trip to a coffee producing origin, in this case Nicaragua. And went on a trip with a great roaster called Counterculture Coffee. And one of the things that was really kind of impressed upon me was how much really, really hard work it takes to produce really low quality coffee. And there's very, very high quality coffee out there, and the level of work that goes into that is staggering. So basically I just wanted to go through kind of the life cycle of coffee on the farms, and basically everything that happens before it gets here, before it gets roasted and brewed. There's a lot of information out there online about brewing coffee and even roasting. There's not a lot about origin that's easy to access, at least. So if anyone has any questions, a lot of this stuff, like the first few times I've heard it, can be a little confusing too. So if I'm being unclear on anything, just stop me and feel free to ask questions. This is just one of my favorite pictures from the trip. This is us coming down from a farm in Nicaragua in a region called Madriz. It's in the northwestern part of the country. It's some of the higher altitude land in Nicaragua, which is good for really good coffee. And it's right on the border with Honduras. So basically, coffee production around the world is generally done in this belt, the tropical belt here. There's 3 main coffee growing regions. You've got the Americas, Central and South America, Eastern Ethiopia, Kenya, Ethiopia, or Eastern Africa rather, Yemen, Ethiopia, Kenya, also Burundi and Rwanda. And then over in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Sumatra, Papua New Guinea. One really interesting thing about coffee that is a little known fact is that all coffee in the world originates in Ethiopia. That is the only place in the world that coffee is indigenous to, naturally. And at about the 17th century, coffee started making its way around the world first through Arab traders. It kind of skipped over the Red Sea from Ethiopia into Yemen, and then it went up through Southeast Asia, and then European traders were actually the ones that brought it to Central America, South America, and that was, again, late 18th century, early 19th century. Basically, there's 3 species of coffee plant. The one that we're most concerned with is Coffea arabica. That's the highest quality species, and within that species, there's thousands of varieties. So it's kind of like apples. You've got Gala and Pink Lady, Granny Smith, Red Delicious. They're all apples, but they're very different taste profiles. And another interesting thing about Ethiopia is that because it's the birthplace of coffee, within that country there are still thousands of undiscovered varieties or unclassified varieties that grow wild in the jungles in western Ethiopia. Great coffee, Coffea arabica, grows at pretty high altitudes, generally 1,000 to 2,000 feet, up to maybe 8,000 to 9,000 feet. The higher you go, generally, the higher the potential for quality coffee, and the harder it is to pick, because the terrain gets pretty rugged up there. So again, really great coffee, high quality coffee is a lot of work. So right now, actually, in Central America, this is starting to happen. This is the beginning of the coffee flowering cycle. So the harvest in Central America generally lasts from about November, December till about March. So it's just finishing up now. After all the coffee cherries are picked, and we'll get to that in a little bit, the plant kind of rests for a little bit and then starts to flower again. This is a coffee plant kind of in full bloom. When I was in Nicaragua, the coffee plants weren't at this stage yet, but I'm told it's a really beautiful sight, and that the aroma from the flowers is kind of similar to jasmine. It's supposed to kind of like fill up the mountainside with those scents. So coffee is a fruit, and not many people know that, actually. At least a lot of customers that I've spoken to in different cafes that I've worked in. So what happens is those flowers develop around this time of year, and then in about 9 to 10 months, these cherries are produced and mature. A lot of times, it's very common, like you'll see here in this picture, the coffee cherries don't all ripen at the same rate. And this is another thing that adds to the labor of picking coffee, because you can't just kind of go through and strip pick everything. To really get the highest quality coffee, you want to pick really bright red, ripe cherry. So farmers will have to make multiple passes through the same swaths of land on a farm to make sure they're only picking the right cherry. Coffee plants can be different depending on variety, can look different. This is another photo, kind of a close-up, where you see the cherries are kind of like bunched together, these little bunches here. There are plants that are more higher yielding, higher productive, where the cherries are all kind of like really bunched together there. A lot of times when farmers are deciding which varieties to plant, most of the time yield and disease resistance is favored. But a lot of times those plant varieties aren't the highest quality tasting. So there are some farmers who kind of take a riskier route, and they plant heirloom varieties that are very high quality, but more susceptible to disease, not as high yielding. But hopefully the thinking goes that they'll be able to get a much higher price for that really high quality coffee. It'll kind of offset just producing lots of mediocre or poor quality coffee. This is a picture that I took in Nicaragua. There has been some stuff in the news about this, but there is a really bad outbreak of a phenomenon called coffee leaf rust in Central America right now. It's a fungus that attacks the tree. And you can see on these leaves here, I don't know how well it shows up, but some spots and some kind of orange spots. That's actually the fungus on the tree. And what happens is the tree responding to this drops its leaves, and then it's not able to photosynthesize food for the berries. So this is really common in Central America, especially this year. What you'll see is some kind of ripe cherry, red, left on the tree. It still needs to be picked. And then a lot of green, unripe cherry that will just turn black and die. It won't ever develop because it can't get enough energy from the plant. It's a really serious problem. It's always existed in a lot of coffee growing areas, but generally at lower altitudes where lower quality coffee is grown. At the higher altitudes, this is the first time that a lot of farmers are seeing this in Central America. And a lot of the understood reasons are climate change. It's getting warmer at higher altitudes, and it's raining a lot of periods during the year when it normally wouldn't rain, and that can help spread the fungus. So it's worth mentioning. And basically this year, for a lot of countries in Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, they're talking somewhere between a 15 to 20% reduction in the crop. Next year, it'll be worse because the plants won't be able to flower and produce cherry. So there will still be really delicious coffee coming from Central America. It'll just be more and more expensive as the years go on. Yeah?
How are they trying to address that issue?
It's tough. There's a lot of like government agencies that are kind of working on it. You can spray But a lot of the farms, like this particular farm that we were at, is certified organic. And what they would have to spray to treat the fungus, they would lose their certification. The other problem is if you spray and your neighbors don't, then the fungus is still going to blow over and you still have to just keep treating your trees with these chemicals. The other issue, or the other, I guess, thing that was talked about with farmers there was pulling out the infected plants and replanting with more disease-resistant varieties. But the two problems with that are that it takes about 3 to 5 years before a coffee plant starts developing cherry. And also, when that plant is producing, it's not going to taste as good because they're lower quality plants.
So that plant,
I'm sorry?
Can you grow coffee trees in Africa or in the Middle East?
Yes.
Would they also be susceptible to this kind of fungus?
Yeah, it's interesting in Sri Lanka. It used to be called Ceylon, and it was either a Dutch or a French colony. That island at one point was completely populated with coffee plants. That's all they grew there. And this coffee leaf rust killed every plant on the island and decimated the island, and now they grow tea there. You're like Ceylon tea. So the coffee leaf rust exists around the world. It seems to be really bad in Central America now. Some places in South America, like Colombia, the government has a lot of money and they've done a lot of research on prevention and they've pushed a lot of disease-resistant varieties. So it can be controlled. The big problem with leaf rust this year is, again, at these higher altitude farms, these farmers have never had to deal with it because it wasn't an issue in years past. So they haven't done a lot of the preventative measures that it takes to keep their farms healthy. So this is a picture in some form that you'll see on a lot of coffee farms for pickers. These are just kind of varying levels of ripeness. Now, like low-grade coffee, commodity coffee, when the pickers go out and pick, they'll just kind of grab any and everything because they're getting paid by the pound. They're incentivized to pick as much as possible. All this stuff kind of gets mixed together. The thing that makes really high-quality specialty coffee different is that the pickers hopefully are only picking cherry that are somewhere around in here, the bright red and the kind of deeper burgundy red. One of the things we'll see throughout some of these photos is just constant sorting. At every stage, there's a lot of attention to detail and intention to sorting out the lower quality coffees throughout all the steps. And it's important to note that the lower quality coffees get sold too. They don't get thrown away. They separate it out, and the really smart farms and cooperatives have different levels of quality that they're sorting out through the harvest. So they can sell the highest quality for the most money, get the best price for it, and the lowest quality is sold into commodity markets or just used for like internal consumption in the country. So this is a picker in a farm here. This is a, coffee farms can look very different depending on where you are. I know when I hear the word farm, I think of plants kind of planted neatly in a row. A lot of high quality farms that are high up in the mountain are actually kind of really spread out, and they're intermixed with other trees, shading plants, banana trees. This is I'm not sure where this picture is from, but this is a pretty densely planted plot of land here. And the pickers, they'll have these, a lot of times they'll have these wicker or plastic baskets that they'll kind of like cinch to their waist, and they'll go through and pick. A lot of times they'll pick from 6 or 7 in the morning until about noon, and they'll bring their cherry in to start processing, which we'll go into a little bit more. Just some more photos of some pickers here. So before the pickers turn in their coffee for processing, again, the really high quality, high level farms, they're going to do a little pre-sorting. So this gentleman here is just picking out all the underripe and overripe or insect damaged cherry that he sees. And again, this coffee will eventually be sold somewhere. but they want to keep it away and separate from the really ripe cherry. It has the most kind of sugar content. So we've got our beautiful red ripe coffee cherry here that's ready to get processed. And what that means is basically we're trying to get down to the bean, which is actually, it's not quite a bean, it's actually a seed. So the coffee that you see here, and we'll pass these around, is green coffee. This is unroasted coffee. And that is the seed of this coffee cherry. So as you can see, you've got the outer skin, the pulp, and the pectin layer, which are kind of like the fruit of the cherry. And then this parchment coat, which kind of acts as a thin shell that protects the coffee bean through some of the drying. So the whole point of processing coffee is basically to remove these layers and get down to the parchment layer, and eventually down to the green bean so it can be sent to roasters. Now there are three main ways to basically separate this bean from the cherry. By far the most kind of popular and I guess highest quality, you could say, well that's slightly subjective, is washing coffee. So a lot of times on coffee bags you'll see a washed coffee. This is a little washing mill on the farm that we picked coffee on in Nicaragua. And basically what happens is the pickers will pick their cherry, load it up, they get paid by the bucket. In this area of Nicaragua, the best pickers make about $3 a day, which is actually pretty good. The minimum wage in Nicaragua is about $1 per day, and it's not enforced at all. This gentleman, Fredman here, he works with the cooperative that we were visiting, and through an interpreter he asked us how was picking coffee. I said, oh, it was hard work. And he scoffed at us, he laughed at us, and said that actually picking the coffee is some of the easiest work that people in this area do all year, and they look forward to it. Coffee production is a lot of hard work, but the actual picking, you're just kind of hanging out in the forest, picking coffee. It's not a ton of heavy lifting. It's not super backbreaking. A lot of the stuff that comes after this can be. So the pickers get paid by the bucket of cherry that they bring in. They bring it up this ramp here, and they drop it down a chute, and it goes into this machine, which is a depulper. And basically this machine has a big cylinder in it with teeth, and it can be hand cranked, which is a lot of work. Or fortunately, these farmers had this one set up to a little gasoline motor. And the wheel spins around, the cherry goes through, and it basically rips the outer part of the coffee cherry off and spits it out in the backside there. On this other side, you've got parchment coffee. So you've got the coffee bean surrounded by that thin parchment shell, and then a lot of really sticky fruit around it. It's a very thin layer. It's not quite like biting into a cherry. The seed and the parchment of a cherry take up most of the space. Like when you go to eat it, you have to be really careful because you can bite down and hurt your teeth. So washing the coffee, what we're trying to do is get the sticky fruit off the parchment so that we can dry the coffee properly. And what they'll do is basically let the coffee ferment, which is not like an alcoholic fermentation. They basically just let it sit. In different places around the world, they do it differently. Sometimes there's reasons for it that are quality-based. Sometimes it's just agricultural traditions. You ask, why do you do it this way? They say, this is how we've always done it. So letting the coffee ferment, they'll either put it underwater or they'll leave it out in open air for anywhere from 12 to 36 hours. And natural yeast and bacteria in the air kind of soften up this fruit and make it easier to wash off. So after the coffee sits for a while, they put it in these big tanks and push it around, and that sticky fruit layer comes off. In Africa, a lot of times you'll see these long washing channels where these guys will take rakes and push the parchment coffee through. And as they push it through, again, all that sticky kind of fruit washes off after it's softened up in the fermentation. After the coffee is washed, it's put out to dry. There's lots of different ways to dry coffee. It's a really important step to the quality. If the coffee is dried too quickly, then the parchment layer will crack and it will let in oxygen and sunlight and moisture, which are bad things for any food if you're trying to keep it good. So you want to try and extend the drying period as long as possible, and this is a big step in really high quality coffees. Lots of different ways to dry coffee too. This is one of the better ways. This is very common in East Africa. They dry on raised beds. And one of the advantages of that too is that you can sort out bad beans as the coffee is drying. A lot of time this work, you see it done by women, although men will do it too, depending where you're at. Another really common thing that you'll see in Central and South America is patio drying. These big cement patios, and they'll just dump the parchment coffee off, and they're constantly pushing it and raking it to turn the coffee so that it dries evenly, which is really important. This is in Nicaragua. This is a mill that we visited where they're actually drying on these mesh tarps that are lined with like organic material underneath, so it helps create some airflow, again, so you get some even drying. A lot of times coffee is just dried on the ground on tarps. In some places like Sumatra, it's Indonesia, it's not, they don't use tarps at all. It just dries on the ground. And there's street dogs and who knows what walking through it. Sometimes you can taste that. This is another, these are called solar dryers. They're basically covered areas to keep the direct sun off of it. Again, to slow down drying a little bit. Some places use mechanical dryers also, which are just basically large drying machines that are heated at very low temperatures. Most places, this isn't the best way to do it, but there are some farmers and mills who've kind of figured out how to do it slowly and produce good coffee from it. So all that was washed coffee. Another way to process coffee is called pulp natural. So after the coffee is brought into the mill and they rip off the cherry, and there's still a lot of that sticky fruit, instead of washing that fruit off, they just leave it on and dry it with that sticky fruit on. So you can see like there's some skin and the fruit kind of turns yellow. It kind of discolors a little bit. This can add some flavor characteristics to the coffee, like body, and it can add a little sweetness. It can also remove some pleasant characteristics of coffee, like acidity. So a lot of times pulp natural coffees are used in espresso blends. One risk with this is that it takes a lot longer for the coffee to dry. Coffee drying is tricky. You don't want it to be too short because it'll damage the coffee. The longer the coffee takes to dry, the more risk there is. That it could rain and the coffee could get wet again. There could be insect damage, especially with the sticky fruit that attracts insects. So it's a risky step. An advantage of the pulp natural drying too is that they don't use as much water. And water can be very scarce in a lot of these producing areas.
One of the problems I have with coffee is that it is usually very acidic. Is this the best way of getting rid of acid, or is that the most common way?
You know, I think probably the most common way would be in roasting. Generally, the darker coffee is roasted, the lower the acidity levels. And honestly, most coffee that you'll see in the store, you won't be able to find this kind of information on the bag. You know, whether it was a washed coffee or a pulp natural.
Well, there's this instant coffee called kava, which is acid reduced. It doesn't taste that great, but if you're not feeling well, you can drink it without getting, like this horrible, feeling of, acid in the stomach.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I think that probably like the best way to go if you're looking for lower acid coffees are looking for darker roasted coffees, or there are actually some regions that are just kind of known for higher and lower levels of acidity. If you don't like acidic coffee, I would stay away from African coffees, Kenya, Ethiopia. A lot of times coffees from Sumatra, Papua New Guinea, Brazil can have lower acid levels.
My favorite one is a place called Blue Mountain, I guess it's in the Caribbean.
Yeah, it's from Jamaica.
Jamaica,
Yeah,
that's the best I've ever had.
yeah, that's a popular one. That's along with like Kona, you hear that a lot. A lot of the stuff with Blue Mountain and Kona, it can be produced well. A lot of the mystique around those names is really kind of marketing driven. There are a lot higher quality, better tasting coffees out there. But people have kind of known those over the years. So this is a big drying patio in El Salvador. And this is kind of interesting because you can see all three processes here. They've got a lot of washed coffee drying here. The little darker patch in the middle where the gentleman's standing is pulp natural coffee drying. And then up in the corner, you've got natural processed coffee. Natural process is the easiest to explain. Basically, they pick the coffee cherry ripe and let it dry in the sun. So the bean and everything dries inside the fruit. And because of this, the bean really absorbs a lot of very kind of jammy, fruity flavors. And it can really affect the flavor of the coffee. Sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way. These coffees can taste really overly fermented sometimes. This is coffee from Nicaragua, and we were able to taste some of this. And the couple naturals that we tasted like pickle brine. It was pretty intense.
Are you able to characterize for us who have never tasted the fruit what it tastes like?
Yeah, it's if you eat ripe fruit from the tree, it can be very, very sweet, and it's like got a syrupy kind of milky texture to it. But it's again the fruit layer is so thin that there's not much there. So you kind of put the cherry in and you kind of bite down gently and you spit out the parchment, which is most of the coffee, and you're just left with the skin and a little bit of the pulp.
It's almost like a grape, like a green grape. The inside layer is that sweet.
Yeah, the flavor, but there's just not as much there because it'd be like the seed is taking up most of the space. I've heard it described as watermelon also. I didn't think it was quite that good. Some lower quality varieties or some underripe cherry will taste kind of peppery, like red pepper or green pepper.
Is this the stage that companies like New Chapter make out their supplement that's supposed to be, from the coffee berry, supposed to be extremely high?
The green coffee extract.
Well, no, it says on the label red cherry extract, and it's supposed to be extremely high in antioxidants, and it's in a powdered form.
Huh.
Put out by New Chapter.
I don't know about that, but we've actually brought a little bit with us too that we'll be passing around is cascara, which is a tea that's made from the skin of the coffee fruit, and maybe they're grounding the skin.
It's in large capsules.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
So this is another photo of coffee drying on these beds here. This is in Nicaragua. This is really unusual actually to see these kind of raised drying beds. This is kind of an experimental part of the mill that we were visiting. And again, we tasted some of these coffees. Some were good and some were not very good.
Can I just ask you, were you all in agreement over what was good and what was not good?
For the most part, yeah. We'll get into, again, at the end a little bit, cupping coffees and evaluating coffees professionally. And they're scored on a 100-point scale. And most trained cuppers, the variance and score they'll give a coffee is about 2 points, which is pretty good to kind of objectify such a subjective experience, tasting coffee or tasting anything. Yeah.
Since they vary so much in flavor, how do you sort of distill out the different flavors to decide whether you think are really good about all of them or bad about all of them? So different flavors.
Well, when coffee is evaluated by professionals, generally you're looking at some kind of big categories like in wine, like you're looking for body, acidity, sweetness. These kind of flavor descriptions, like you'll hear coffees, described as chocolatey or nutty or fruity. Those are a little bit more subjective. And again, we're really talking about the very, very tip top of coffee production quality. A lot of coffee that's commodity grade, a lot of it tastes the same. A lot of it kind of lacks character. And these coffees, again, because of the amount of attention and work and selection that's put into them, that's where you can really taste some of the plant variety differences and the terroir differences.
You can't say that there could be a great variety of flavor and still evaluate any of these flavors as good or bad.
Yes, yeah,
Overall.
yeah, absolutely. A coffee doesn't all have to taste chocolatey or all taste fruity to be good. There are kind of differences. And a lot of it's in the context of the place where it's grown, too. The coffee that we're going to have today is from a farm in Guatemala called Esperanza. It's one of the best Guatemalan coffees I've ever tasted. I think it's a really, really amazing coffee. And if you drink it black, to me, I taste peaches and citrus. And it has like a really floral aroma to it. It's really nice, too. A lot of kind of mid-grade Guatemalan coffees can be really great for, again, the world of coffee, but they're not as complex flavor-wise.
What did we just drink now?
That is the Esperanza from Guatemala. Yeah, that's a really, really special coffee. That's been a big favorite at the shop for a long time.
I normally don't drink my coffee black.
Uh-huh.
This actually almost tastes like when it cools off, I can probably drink it. What is it about this that's making it so that I can stomach it?
Partly, it's because it's very, very high quality coffee to begin with.
But I mean, is it the acidity or is it, like, I couldn't touch Starbucks. Starbucks is like acid or something.
Yeah. I don't know.
You wouldn't know.
It's very high quality and it's roasted lightly, which actually, for most Starbucks coffees, I would think that this probably has a greater amount of acidity, at least perceived.
Well, I'm trying to determine what about this I like. I like strong coffee, but this is pleasant.
Yeah.
But I never drink black.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of bitter flavors come from poor production, poor picking. Again, this coffee is a really good example of the things we're talking about here today. It's the cream of the crop, literally. And a lot of specialty coffee, Starbucks buys specialty grade coffee. It's not all equally good, but specialty coffee makes up probably 3% or 2-3% of global coffee production, which is a lot. So these beans are very, very, very special. In like wine terms, these are like Burgundy, Grand Crus, from the best vintages. Except the best farms, produce these every year.
Starbucks, for example, has a very dark blend and a lighter blend.
Mhm.
What makes the difference there? Is that in the way it's roasted?
Yeah, just in the roasting. Generally, higher quality coffees, again, you want to roast lightly so that you don't taste the roasting characteristic. And you want to just taste more of the plant variety and the terroir where it was grown.
So it's better to purchase a light blend than a dark blend?
It depends on your preferences, but if you trust the roaster that they're buying really high quality coffee, and we'll go into a little bit at the end. Rachel will talk about like kind of how to look at a bag and kind of sense whether it's high quality or not. But it really depends on your preference.
And what is the difference in espresso?
Espresso really is just a way of making coffee. You'll see espresso blends or espresso roasts, but generally, traditionally, coffees have been roasted a little bit darker for espresso preparation. But actually the term espresso doesn't apply to the coffee, it just applies to the way that the coffee is made.
So this is a light roast.
Yeah, that would be a light to medium roast. And that's from a roaster in Boston called Terroir Coffee. So they're somewhat nearby. I just wanted to mention really quickly, this is another process that's used primarily in Brazil. These are Brazilian naturals. And basically they let the coffee dry almost completely on the tree, almost like raisins. Generally, it's a lower quality way to produce coffee, but there can be some good results. And actually at the shop right now, we have a really great Brazilian natural on the menu. Okay, so this is parchment coffee that's been dried. This is a washed coffee. This is a pretty good example of this. What you don't want to see is kind of like this cracking up here. That means, again, oxygen and light and moisture could have gotten in and damaged the bean. But this is pretty good looking parchment that's ready to be moved along in the process here for export. So farmers, most coffee is produced by smallholders. These are farmers with very tiny farms. We visited farms that were 2 acres, 5 acres, very small. In this area in Nicaragua, we visited a cooperative. There's about 146 producer members. They bring their coffee, their parchment coffee, to the cooperative. The coffee's weighed. They're given a partial payment right there. And then the cooperative takes the coffee to another mill to be prepared for export. After the coffee is exported and sold for its final price, those profits are given back to the cooperative and then distributed amongst the members equally. So we talked about the little wet mill that we saw in Nicaragua, and wet mills can vary in size too. But that's when the coffee's processed. They get down to the parchment. It's been dried. It's brought to a dry mill. This is a mill in Nicaragua that was just filled with coffee waiting to be processed. These bags are probably anywhere from 120 to 150 pounds of coffee each. Could be a little more, even still has the parchment on. And there's just these warehouses where it's just stacked to the ceiling. It's just coffee forever. This coffee is resting, basically waiting to get processed for export.
Between the red and the white bag?
I don't think so. A lot of the coffees, when they're brought to either the cooperative or the dry mill, they're pretty extensively labeled. Again, at the really high quality places. So they're sorted by what day they were picked, if they're a certain plant variety, what farm, what altitude they came from. Commodity grade and cheaper coffees are just all blended together. Yes?
This coffee that you served us, when might that have been picked, and what influence is the amount of time between picking and brewing?
That's a good question. That coffee was from last year's harvest.
Mm-hmm.
So that coffee was picked probably between January and March of last year. Generally, the Central American coffees start arriving in the late spring. So that probably got to the roaster May, June. They spend a little time working with it, roasting it a few different ways, and then they'll sell it until they run out of it. This particular roaster, I guess I won't go into the details of this particular roaster, but in general, green coffee should be roasted within 6 months to a year after it's picked. After that, it won't go bad, it won't spoil, but it'll start to be faded and kind of lose a lot of the really complex attributes that the coffee was bought for in the first place. Another picture of a mill, I believe this one's in Hawaii. Basically, these big machines are there to remove the parchment, remove that shell layer around the coffee. So they'll have these big kind of fans that suck it up in the machines. They polish off the parchment, and you're left with just green coffee. And again, the sorting, really important. They put the coffee, after it's been hulled, on these density sorters, so these big tables that just vibrate like crazy. And the higher density beans kind of slide to one side, and the lower density beans slide to the other. And the higher density beans are worth more. They're more valuable, they're higher quality. You also see these screens here. They'll separate the coffee by bean size too, so they'll use different size screens. So you'll have larger beans, smaller beans. And again, in general, larger beans are valued more. This process is called grading. So coffees have a grade, and it's a little different depending on what country you're in. A lot of times on bags of like Kenyan coffee, you'll see Kenya AA, Kenya AB. That isn't like a report card. That's the size, the grade of the beans. It means they're the most dense and the biggest. AB is a little bit smaller. There are also pea berries, which you may have heard of. And one thing that I neglected to mention is that the reason coffee beans are flat on one side is because there are two beans that sit inside of a cherry, and the flat part sits up against each other. There's a mutation, it's a natural mutation that occurs in about 10% of coffee plants, where the cherry only produces one seed, and it's round. And those seeds, those pea berries, as they're called, are separated out during the final stages of processing, and they're sold separately too, because they're valued for having a more kind of intense flavor than the flat bean seeds. So this is some of the stuff that they're trying to sort for. This is defect coffee. This is really bad. You can see this is like really bad. You can see some insect damage. Sometimes there'll be fungal damage to the coffee. All sorts of stuff can happen. And again, you want to try and get rid of this before the coffee is bagged for export. So this is green coffee. This is the finished product before it leaves port. Rachel's going to pass around some. This is what gets put into the big burlap sacks that you may have seen before and exported to roasters all over the world. Roasting is something we could probably talk another hour about, so I'll glance over it. It's very important. And there are a lot of roasters out there who don't treat roasting with the same attention to detail as others. You can just kind of put it in the roaster till it turns brown, it's done. And other roasters are treated like a science and an art, and it really is. Especially if you're working with really, really high quality coffee.
These beans are small.
They're small, yeah, in the roasting process, they actually almost double in size from some of the chemical reactions that happen when the coffee expands. So one of the last steps after the coffee is processed is it needs to be tasted and evaluated to see if it's good or not. This is a lab in the mill that we visited in Ocotal, Nicaragua. These are little coffee roasters for doing small batches. You probably do anywhere from 1 to 5 pounds in these roasters. These gentlemen on the side are actually hand sorting through green coffee samples and counting how many defects per sample. And that information all gets included in the grading of the coffee, and it's provided to buyers. And this is a cupping room. Basically, cupping is a formal way to evaluate coffees. So each of these 3 cups will be 1 coffee, and it's basically a ritual of you go through, you smell the ground coffee, they add water, you smell the wet coffee, and then you go through after the coffee's cooled and you taste it with a spoon. And this is where the scoring comes in. So if I were a coffee buyer and I wanted to travel to Nicaragua and I was looking for some really great coffees, I would set up a meeting at a mill like this, and they would put out a table of coffees anywhere from 10 to 60 coffees, and you just spend the day sipping coffee. Hopefully spitting it all out so you don't go crazy too. And scoring the coffees and evaluating them.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned before this that they were bagging it up and sending it to the roasters. Do most of the countries roast it themselves, or you mentioned the one in Boston is a roaster? I mean, how much is exported to be roasted and how much is roasted in?
Almost all coffee exported is unroasted. Because after roasting, the coffee only has a shelf life of about 2 to 4 weeks before the flavors really start dipping. It can take months for these shipping containers to arrive. So they send it unroasted. You'll hear a lot of times, like, someone will take a vacation to like Costa Rica and say, oh, I had the best coffee in Costa Rica. There's a lot of environmental kind of fun things with that. You're in Costa Rica drinking coffee and it's beautiful. But generally, the beans that are in that country that are left there are the lower quality because all the really good stuff gets exported because it's valuable. Costa Rica might be a bad example because that country has a little bit more money than a lot of other coffee producing countries. And generally, the coffee that's roasted there too, as a general rule, probably isn't roasted with the same care that it would be by really high quality roasters in the US or in Europe, Asia, wherever.
Yeah, I was given a big bag of coffee that was, you know, roasted and ground up in Costa Rica. It was all in Spanish, but they put like 20% of it with sugar. You know, it was just, it was weird.
Yeah, that's pretty common, probably because the coffee was really low quality and needed
Yeah,
it.
it was kind of like a bitter taste, so they put the sugar in to sort of soften it.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
You can't buy any kind of ground coffee with the sugar already mixed in, especially so much.
Yeah, yeah. Sir?
Going back about 20 years ago, a good friend of mine was a coffee taster, had that job. And what he told me 20 years ago was that Germany, far and above every other country, bought the most superior coffee on the planet. How much of that has changed in the United States in the last 10 years?
Last 10 years, I'd really say 15 to 20, actually, even taking it, including Starbucks in that. The coffee consumption in America has changed dramatically. We're really buying super high quality coffee. So the commodity grade coffee that is probably sitting in a lot of these containers sells green, unroasted, sells for anywhere from $1.30 to $1.60 per pound. Roasters and really quality minded importers now are paying anywhere from $3 to $6 up per pound. And that's a good thing for everybody, you know, especially producers. And you know, again, subjects like fair trade and direct trade are kind of a whole different topic, but with really, really high quality coffee, generally roasters and traders and importers are buying directly from farms that are treating their employees well, you know, forming democratic cooperatives, and making sure the money is getting to the right place. Because it's good for everyone. It's good for producers, and we get really tasty coffee. There's really strong coffee cultures in Scandinavia and in Asia too. Japan, South Korea, and then countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they buy very, very high quality coffee as well. And it's becoming more and more like wine. You hear that analogy a lot. Although I think coffee is a lot harder. You know, wine is kind of bottled and it's shipped to us, and we pop it open and we're ready to enjoy it. But you can see all the work that goes into coffee production at origin, and then they send it off to a roaster who has a chance to just kill it, burn it, and then a roaster sends it to someone like me who has a chance to just, you know, not pay attention to what I'm doing and brew it improperly. So to really get a really amazing cup of coffee it's nothing short of a miracle.
It's true.
It's like I mean that like literally. It's a miracle. Oh yes, Mrs. You have a question?
How do you make decaf coffee?
Decaf coffee is basically, so when green coffee is exported from countries of origin, there are certain places around the world that have trademarked or patented processes for decaffeination. And it's kind of a long story, but the green coffee is treated either naturally with water and steam, or cheap coffee, they'll use methylene chloride, which is like a dry cleaning solvent, ethyl acetate, which is like another solvent that's derived from fruit, so sometimes you'll see the all natural in parentheses around it. But basically, green coffee is sent somewhere else to be decaffeinated, and then it's rebagged and then sent to the roaster. So it actually adds a lot of cost to the process and shipping. Yes?
How can you tell whether you're buying the methylene chloride type rather than water type?
So what you want to look for on the bag, again, if it's a high quality roaster, they should have the information on the bag. You're looking for water process, is basically the term they use. Yeah, the two that are the highest quality are the Swiss water process. It's actually done in Canada. Kind of haven't figured that out yet, why it's called the Swiss water process. And there's a mountain water process. It's done in Mexico. But that should be on there, on the bag. There's also, they'll use carbon dioxide too, like liquefied CO2, which isn't as bad as the methylene chloride. And that
Water's better?
Yeah, yeah. It's better for the flavors. And it's worth noting with those chemicals too, they have a very low volatility. So in the roaster, all that stuff burns off, but you don't know what kind of compounds are getting left behind. And it adds a really bad taste to the coffee too.
But the decaffeination process is getting better and better. But it does change the beans. I mean, just briefly, the water process, you basically soak green coffee in water so that everything, all of the solubles come out and fully saturate the water. And then the water is moved through a filter that basically binds with the caffeine. So it takes out the caffeine. So then you have water that is fully saturated with everything but caffeine. You put new green coffee in. And in theory, the only thing that comes out is the caffeine. But of course, it's, you are soaking the coffee in water, and coffee is soluble. So it does change it a little bit.
And, yeah, sure.
After the beans are roasted, does it matter how soon you ground it and drink it?
Yeah, you want to keep them, ideally, you want to keep them whole bean, until you want to prepare the coffee. When you grind the coffee, you're basically exposing a lot more surface area to oxygen, and that's bad. It's losing some of the really nice aromatic qualities you're looking
How
for.
long you keep the whole beans?
Yeah, generally within 2 to 4 weeks is the common thinking. And again, if you're buying really darkly roasted coffee or a coffee that is of lower quality, it's going to be harder to taste that difference, 2 months after you bought it. But really high quality coffees, you can notice it. And again, they don't go bad, they don't go rancid, they're just not as intense. They're not as pleasant.
No expiration dates, right?
Not really. And one of the things I think Rachel will probably mention is when you're buying coffee, you want to see a date on the bag when it was roasted, not an expiration date or not a use by date, because that doesn't give you any information as to when it was roasted. Any other questions?
Yeah, is it possible to go to a store? I mean, you have to almost go to a shop like yours or something to buy something that was roasted less than 4 weeks ago.
Generally, yeah. Yeah, you want to either buy it online or you want to go to a cafe. Only espresso dealer. With the really high quality coffee, yes. You can find coffee from great roasters in some grocery stores, like Whole Foods, Fresh Market. A lot of times they'll be pretty old. And that just has to do with what the kind of logistics of supplying grocery stores with bulk coffee like that.
Well, they're always supposed to roast their own, right?
Well, two winners doing too, but are they good?
They're not known for the roasting. I'll say that.
Fairway.
I'm sorry.
Fairway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend in California that he swore by using an air popcorn maker, and he
Yeah.
roasted his own.
Yeah.
And he said came out good. I just don't know how you would know when it's ready, like you were just talking about over roasting. I just can imagine, you know when popcorn's ready, because it's popcorn.
Right.
But I'm sure the coffee bean doesn't fly out when it's ready, so.
Yeah, that's like a really common way to roast coffee at
But
home.
he said he swore by it, and he said it tasted delicious, so he'd buy his own bean and do it when he needed to, and then grind it, obviously.
There's tons of like videos on YouTube and.
So if you're really curious, you can give it a
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Going back to the farming process,
Mhm.
I was at a coffee region once and I noticed most of the trees had some kind of canvas cloth over all the trees. What was the purpose of that?
Basically, shading is generally good for coffee plants because it slows the maturation of the coffee cherry. The longer amount of time the cherry is able to mature on the tree, it's accruing more sugars and acids and good chemicals that come out in the roasting. They come out as really complex flavors. So, a lot of times we'll be asked, customers will say, is this a shade-grown coffee? It may not have, in all the coffee that we serve in our cafe and in kind of other like-minded cafes, it's all very high quality. Very few of those coffees may have that shade-grown certification, but it's almost a given they're going to be shade-grown because that's a very fundamental part of producing really high-quality cherry, even before the coffee's picked and processed. Yes?
Coffee supposedly has some health benefits now, right?
It depends on which
Lots.
week you read, you read the paper, but yes, I know there are some, and I'm not an expert in that.
It certainly has a plethora of antioxidants. It has more than blueberries and.
But does it matter, the grade of the coffee, the better quality coffee gives you more health benefits than the lower quality?
Between different species. There's within Arabica, I think it's probably pretty similar. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a science major in that, but different species entirely, like Robusta, which is a lower grade. It's not exactly known for its flavor. That potentially is quite different as far as health benefits are concerned, because it has a bigger variance.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Hey.
And,
And there's if you want to leave your email address, I can send out a home brewing sort of cheat sheet, and also just a more in-depth, there's a cheat sheet that we can pull up here, but then also just a more in-depth overview of some of the things that Kyle spoke to, and also just the way that you can achieve a tasty cup of coffee at home. And we'll also do more classes, both potentially here and at our shop, and guide you hands-on how to do that. There are a lot of important factors to consider, even beyond where your coffee comes from and everything that happens before it even gets to you. What you then do with it, there are a lot of things to consider, and even just the quality of the water. If you noticed, I brought my own jug of water.
Is it best to keep coffee beans in the fridge?
No, it is not. So actually, if you think about how you might store tomatoes, although I guess sometimes they're stored in the fridge, but a tomato would like to just be in a cool, dry, dark place to stay fresh, and that's sort of the same for coffee. So airtight, away from light, away from moisture, and the thing with the fridge and the freezer is that it's very prone to moisture, and so that is sort of death to coffee. So you want to keep it away from that. And just one note about the coffee that you enjoyed today is that coffee, that roaster is he has been able to freeze the unroasted coffee in a way that preserves it. That also is it's a difficult thing to do. Coffee can be frozen if it's done in a very controlled environment where the temperature is stable, and he's had amazing results. I mean, that coffee is from last year's harvest, and it still really sparkles and tastes lovely. But it's a rare thing. Typically speaking, you're going to want to be consuming the coffee from that year's harvest.
Can you just bring your own water? Where did you get your water?
Yeah, what kind of
So-
water is best?
So you can, basically you want to have water that is, tastes clean and fresh, and, doesn't have any sort of visible impurities. But then if you want to get more into the science of it, if your water is too soft and it doesn't have enough minerals in it, it'll actually over extract the coffee, meaning that it'll take the solubles that are in the coffee and it'll pull out too many of them because the water itself doesn't have as much sort of soluble matter in it. And again, if it's too hard, then it'll do the opposite. It won't extract the coffee well enough. So you want to have solubles. You want to have water that has something in it, minerals in it. You don't want to use distilled water. That would be like the softest of all waters and cause not a tasty cup of coffee. But generally speaking, I mean, if you're brewing your coffee at home and you're happy with it and it's comparable to what you can get when you get a coffee out, then chances are your water is going to be okay. But that is something to consider if you sort of are doing everything just so, and you say, but it's just not tasting the same way. Feel free to come and grab some water bring your water bottle, bring something and grab some water from our shop, which runs through a filtration system, and then take that home and test it out. And if you get different results, then we can lead you on what to do from there, where to take that information. But chances are your water is going to be okay for
What about
brewing.
spring water?
Spring water? Yeah, that can be good. Water varies so much, and not even just by area, but even by season. And during this time of year, especially after lots of snow, and then the groundwater, actually, which is where a lot of our water supply comes from, has lots of salt from salting the roads. And so it can have a tremendous impact on the quality of coffee and the way that it affects your equipment at home, all of those things. So it's really tough to say one specific type of water is good. But bottled water, certain brands are controlled, and you can read the pH, and you can read they do give information on dissolved solids in the water. I think maybe even Fiji does it, and certain bottled waters you can access that information. And I'd be happy to send you sort of ideal parameters to look for if you really want to geek out on water. I do like to geek out on water, so happy to provide that information.
Is it important that it's ice cold or very cold before you brew coffee?
No, I mean the temperature at which you brew, the temperature of your water when you are brewing is important. It should be between sort of 195 to 205 degrees, and that simply is to basically be able to extract some of those volatile aromatics and some of those lovely acids and things in the coffee that are not going to extract properly at a lower temperature. But again, if you go too high, then you'll basically kill those delicate flavors. Temperature, basically you're seeing that every little detail along the way is important and can have a dramatic effect. And so, as Kyle said, it's a miracle that you can get a tasty cup of coffee.
Not in the shop, but at home, is there a consensus opinion among the knowing French press, perk, drip?
Sure. So just as far as the best way to brew, so it's really a matter of preference. To a degree, I will say that on the different methods of brewing, which you'll see at the bottom, and also I go into more detail in a document that I can send you. I don't list like a percolator that basically traditionally the water would go and cycle back through the ground coffee, as that would basically take water that already has taken in some of the solubles from the coffee and recycle it back through already extracted coffee and tend to extract more than should be. So when that happens, you're going to get the things that the solubles that are just not as tasty. So you're going to get a lot of bitterness. You're going to get things that just take a cup that at once maybe could have sparkled and been really sweet and clean and get those bitter flavors. So if you just think basically, coffee is about 32%, I believe, soluble in water, and you're only wanting to dissolve about 18 to 22% of that. I'd say, hover right around 20%. And so there are just all sorts of different factors that affect how quickly that process happens, how quickly that extraction happens. And it's a game of, depending upon the brewing method that you choose, be it French press or a machine like I use today, and you're controlling the variables according to that method. So for example, a French press it's a 4-minute brew. And so you want typically speaking, most people let it sit for 4 minutes. And so if you do that, you're going to want the way in which you grind your coffee. If you grind it really, really fine, the same way that you would maybe for espresso, you have tons of surface area exposed, and all of the solubles are going to extract really, really rapidly. And so if you then let that really fine coffee sit for 4 minutes, it's going to taste really bitter and not so pleasant. So you're going to want to use a coarser grind for that method, whereas for espresso, which takes in between 20 or 30 seconds, it's a much finer grind. Does that make sense? And basically, it's a French press is generally not through a paper filter, so you might get a little bit of sediment. Some people like that, some people don't. You will tend to get a little bit sort of richer of a body with a French press, whereas if you run it through a paper filter, like with the machine today, it's gonna be a cleaner cup, and so it really is just a matter of preference.
Could you just briefly talk about 3, 4, and 5 as to what difference it makes in the flavors?
Oh, for those brewing methods?
You mentioned the French press and the drip, but
sure.
The other ones.
So the hybrid that I mentioned in 3 is a device actually that we use at Espresso Me, and it's I should have brought one for an example. It's called the Clever Coffee Dripper because it's so clever. But it's basically, have you seen do you know what I say when I say a Melita filter? So it's sort of, it actually, I could just use the top portion of that machine. That sometimes if you've ever seen just that and you can manually pour the water over and it'll drip straight through into the cup.
Yeah.
So it's a device that looks similar to that. However, there is a sort of a valve on the bottom that doesn't let the water flow through immediately. So it holds it all in. So it once you pour the water, it'll sit and it'll steep like a French press. So you get some of the benefits of that good body and a lot of the solubles that actually just add body and more so even than flavors. You get those things that affect the cup of coffee, and then when you set it on top of a cup, then it triggers that valve to open up and allows it to drain through. So it's kind of in our experience, you sort of get the best of both worlds, and it produces a really consistent cup of coffee. So you can sort of do the same thing every time if you have a good grinder, which I will say is probably the most important thing that you can have, is a grinder that basically produces an even particle size. Because if you think back to that whole surface area thing, if you have some coffee that is big chunks and then you have some that is almost dust, really fine, the rate at which the solubles come out into the water is going to drastically vary. And so the dust is going to produce bitterness in your cup, and the big stuff is going to produce almost sort of a sour and undeveloped flavor in your cup. And when you mix that all together, it doesn't just mix to a tasty cup, it mixes to a not so tasty blend of both worlds. So a good burr grinder is sort of the term to look for. I hate to say it, but I must, as someone who cares about all of the work that's done all the way at the farm, the roaster, and everything, to not share with you that a blade grinder, one of the is not going to give you the most even particle size, and it's not going to do justice potentially to the beans that you purchased.